Thank you for that kind introduction. Thank you all for rising early during the conference week where there may be late nights. As I listened to the previous panel, I reflected on the similarities of the constraints that we face in industry and those that were described for the military. The inability to ever have enough humans would be an example. The cost of rising complexity in terms of our risk tolerance and our risk management capabilities. These are the same all over. There may be somewhere some network of self-associated servers and whatnot where those are not a constraint, but for the most part, what was described for the military is true for the world. I have worked in the domain name system for most of 35 years, which sounds like a lot when you say it that way. And there have been some changes introduced to the DNS that are of interest to this audience, or that I think should be. And so when I was given an opportunity to address you today, I thought, what is happening in the world that the militaries don't seem to be aware of, and maybe it could change their operating conditions. And so this will be a little bit geeky, and I apologize for that, but I promise I won't drag you down into the ones and zeros too long here. These are things we know. In order to have reached this room, this has got to be old information. But just to review, this is not what I think you need to know. This is my context. This is how I understand what you guys do. So human law really is associated with governments. I know there used to be the divine right of kings and laws that were not necessarily made by the people, and we have authoritative governments today. But in every case, law is something that first and foremost is used by the government to ensure continuity of that which is governed. And nations are the indivisible unit of that. Sometimes multiple nations will cooperate or have a treaty or have regional law, but ultimately it is a nation that where laws begin to enter into the picture and begin to affect the shape of history. Now, after Westphalia, it was finally codified as to what you had to have, who you had to be in order to qualify as a nation. And there are basically these three things you must be able to do. You have to have borders, and you have to be able to defend those. Within those borders, the government has to have a monopoly on power. In other words, you won't be thought of as a nation, taken seriously as a nation, if there is more than one group of people who has arms and uses it to try to enforce their will. So in that case, you would expect a civil war to have to complete before it would be seen as a serious nation. And finally, if something emanates from those borders, which has an impact on neighboring nations, then the government of that bordered area is held responsible for it. And so these are the underpinnings of the rule of law. If you don't have these things, then it's going to be very difficult to apply the traditional concept of law. The internet has no borders, so we blew this out of the water. You can't do everything that the rule of law would otherwise make possible or was convened in order to make possible on something where you don't know exactly where something has come from or where it is going and what its intentions are. There is not a checkpoint at the border of a nation in cyberspace where you can control what goods and services come and go and check passports and so forth. There isn't anything like that. And we've seen, certainly in some authoritarian nations, an attempt to do this, but it turns out to be statistical at best. So even in China, which invests millions of people online at any given moment policing the activities of the rest of the population, they still can't catch everything. And that's the greatest investment that I have seen. So people say, oh, AI will change that and make it possible to oppress at greater scale. That may be so, but right now, we're in a place where law does not follow. Now, in the history of armed conflict, we have progressed through a number of domains, and what you'll notice immediately here is that as you get further to the right, you begin to make obsolete some of the things on the left. There is no land power who can stand against a sea power, and no sea power who can stand against an air power, and so forth. Now, space, we're not seeing a whole lot of munitions and kinetic activity coming out of space, but we're certainly seeing it used for information gathering. Being able to take pictures of everything that's happening certainly helps you to figure out what to do with the rest of your forces. So it's relevant here. Now, finally, we have moved into the information age. And what I mean by that is that almost everything of value in the world has either been transformed into information, or it can be controlled if you have enough information about it. And so information is to the right of all of these other things. If you are an information superpower and your adversary is not, you can often choose when and where to confront, and you can often predict who has what advantage and what the outcome will be. So all of us in this room have to move to the right because the adversaries of NATO and indeed of democracy are moving to the right. So often we don't ask for these things, right? We're minding our own business, everything is working fine, and then suddenly somebody discovers some additional operating domain, and we suddenly have to catch up and become an expert there. That's what happened here. And when we're faced with that kind of challenge, we have three things that we would try to do in this order. You would like to be supreme. You'd like to simply have better capability in this domain of operation. If you can't get that, you'll settle for parity, because that at least is a deterrent. And if you can't get that, you would at least like awareness, so that you know what the capabilities are in the adversary, even during times that you might not have parity or supremacy. So into that mix, I want to describe a little bit about how the internet works. And again, I promise I won't drag you through the weeds on this. But pretty much to communicate on the internet, you need an address. We all get an address for our phone when we join a Wi-Fi network here. And the address can change. And indeed, the address might stay the same, but you might change your location. So the IP address is a pretty fundamental unit of connectivity, and a lot can be done with it. And a lot used to be able to be done with it in terms of monitoring the activities of some target population, because you can see that this IP address is talking to this other IP address, and the content will tend to be encrypted, but just knowing that this IP was talking to that IP, yeah, we don't have that anymore. We have a lot of privacy features built into our phones, which are most internet devices now are phones. But even though a lot of fascinating games are played with IP addresses, they are still in there, and they're still as relevant as before. BGP is a global mesh protocol by which the reachability of an IP address is advertised from somewhere, sometimes from more than one place. Talk to me at the break, I'll tell you why that's important. This is what makes it possible for a company to be online. ISPs do this, cloud service providers do this. This is absolutely vital. It wouldn't matter what IP address you had or how many you had if you didn't have BGP to make it reachable. And then finally, we have DNS. DNS is these funky names that we see, CyCon.org. And that's vital to the web, but also vital to the internet, because while the servers for CyCon are somewhere, BGP knows where they are, and they have some IP addresses, no one is ever going to know what they are. So if I forgot the location of this venue and I needed to go online and find it, I have to have a domain name. I'm not going to get anywhere if all I know is an IP address. And so DNS becomes the front end of reachability. And all internet activities, every click of the mouse, every press of the enter key if you have a laptop, is going to result in some DNS lookups. And after that, the exchange of packets will begin, and BGP will make sure those packets get where they should go. And this is how we do it. And all of these systems are weak from a military point of view. I know this was originally a DARPA project, but they were not interested in hardening it because all they had at that time was government contractors, and they were pretty trustworthy. So a lot of work has had to go into making these things secure against intruders and attackers. But it is that DNS layer that concerns us today, largely because I have a long background with it, but also because that is where a huge change is being pushed into the world, into the internet, into the web, which will affect your operations. So traditionally, we had three kinds of DNS activity. The questions would come in at the bottom, or that bottom cloud, that's your phone. And then they would flow upward as far as they had to go in order to get an answer. Ideally, they would flow a very short distance and get an answer very quickly, because this will dictate how fast your workload progresses. If you press a button on your phone, you want activity. You don't want to sit there and watch the little circle go around. So we have a lot of caching. We have, and it's a huge success. This is the only system in human history that has been able to grow 9 orders of magnitude without a fundamental redesign. So if you meet Paul Makapetras, who invented this in the mid-'80s, you probably owe him a beer, although he drinks red wine. So this is how the system itself, I mean, what I just showed you is how the DNS looks. This is how the internet looks to DNS, which is that you've got your phone and it's talking on some kind of a Wi-Fi, and it's part of a hotel, and the hotel has an ISP, and the ISP has some way to reach the rest of the internet. And if you, in the unlikely event that you wanted to talk to something locally, you might not have to go through the ISP. That hardly ever happens anymore. Almost all traffic is a wide area. But it was a simple system, and in 2000 we were simply trying to make it possible for the internet to grow to essentially become the digital twin of the world's economy. We really wanted it to be that we had a fully generalized data architecture that was permissionless, where you didn't need to ask a phone company whether you could plug something into it. And you see the result, right? We have the internet as it is today. There are problems with that. I mentioned that it's not hardened, and so there are all kinds of security problems with this model, which, had we tried to anticipate them and design a system that would be proof against them, we would still be working on that, and there would be no internet. So we really had to do this half-baked thing and then fix it later, and that's the stage we're at. However, there are other entrants in the field. In particular, if you know the DNS resolution path is the key to everything, it becomes a corporate interest and maybe a national interest to control it, to be able to dictate terms to others who would like to use it, to maybe sell them ads because you can see their traffic and you know what keywords might be of interest. So putting yourself into that path is quite seductive, and a lot of companies have tried to do that. And I'm not going to go through all of these details here. Again, see me at the break. But each of these was an attempt by somebody to get an outsized influence on the DNS resolution path. Some of them failed, some of them did not. In 2013, a contractor for the US government, Edward Snowden, took a bunch of data from the intelligence service and flew to Hong Kong and started talking to the press about what he knew and sharing his data. And it was huge. It was the huge thing in 2013. That's what we talked about then. I'm not a fan, in case that is not apparent from the rest of my remarks. I think that a sysadmin who violates their oath and discloses the information that their customer has placed in their care that's a bad deal. You should not act that way. But it was hugely influential on the Internet Engineering Task Force. And these are a bunch of passionate young people, normally in their 20s, who are coming into this, and they see that, gee, the IETF publishes these request for comments documents, and that is what determines how the Internet will be. So we got to get there. We got to be part of that. And when Mr. Snowden made his disclosures, the current crop of 20-somethings lost their minds, because while the things that Mr. Snowden disclosed were not a big surprise, not particularly novel in human history, nations behave the way they do. And some of it's not pretty to look at. They say it's best not to see how sausage is made. All of a sudden, they got to see how the sausage was made, and they thought this was unique to the Internet, and that governments didn't used to be able to behave this way, and that they shouldn't, and that, by God, within their career, they were going to put an end to it. And that's what they've been working on. And RFC 7258 is a very interesting document, because first they had to state the problem, and they said that the problem is pervasive monitoring. And I guess they were primarily interested in nation-state actors, but once they peeled back the covers, they found that every ISP in that previous picture I showed you is also doing a lot of monitoring. And we have devices in our homes that do parental filtering, for example. And so monitoring of other people's internet traffic happens everywhere. And so this crew of passionate young people wanting to make a better world for us all found that wherever they looked, there was just more pervasive surveillance, and they had to put a stop to it. So first they described the problem. It's worth reading these documents, by the way. They're not long. So the topology by 2010 had evolved so that now you still had the same path between your smartphone at the bottom left and the Internet, that big blob over there. But now you had two things that you needed to talk to. Because first you would talk to some DNS server, and again, you go to it with a name like CyCon.org, and it gives you an address and says, this is the current address affiliated with the service you're asking about. And then you start launching packets toward that address, and BGP takes care of getting them to you. But it was no longer the case that you would get your DNS services from your ISP, because they had proven untrustworthy in the Snowden disclosures. Long known to be untrustworthy as far as that goes. They're in a cutthroat business, race to the bottom, and so on. Anyway, you would go to one part of some distant internet-connected thing to do your DNS transaction, like go to Google, go to OpenDNS, go to Quad9, go somewhere, and then once you got your answer, then you would go off to where the content was actually stored. Those used to be the same place. So we simply added some complexity in order to give people a seat at the table, who all claim that their job is to keep users more safe than every other competing free DNS service who is also trying to attract the same traffic. I have no doubt that some of these actors are in fact well-motivated, passionate patriots, but I don't think that will always be true of all of them, and so we should be worried about the pressures that created this, that caused this to be the evolutionary path. But more to the point of this room and how we all got here, we started with securing the DNS content, and that just meant signing it in a way that perturbations, interference with your operation would be detectable, because the person who's in the middle, who's maybe causing you to hear a different IP address for a certain lookup, they won't have the right digital key to create a signature that will cause their modified version of the response to be authentic. And so we just wanted authenticity. There was no secrecy, no privacy, nothing like that. It was just authenticity. But a number of people said, that's not enough. We need some secrecy. And so DNS over TLS, so-called DOT, was created. And it has the interesting property of you can't see the traffic. It is as secure as most web traffic would be against online interference or surveillance. But it uses standard, so it's a port number, it's a protocol element, which means you can see if you have a firewall or family filter or whatever it is you have, and you want to block this, you can, with one rule. It's very easy because all transactions that use DOT look the same in this one critical way. We loved that because I still believe that the internet is a network of networks, and that if somebody has a network in their home, in their business, whatever, it's up to them what traffic occurs between that network and the rest of the world. So I wanted to preserve essentially the sovereignty of the network, of which the internet is a network of networks. Other people did not feel that so strongly. And they said DOT does not go far enough because it can be blocked. So they created a new secrecy protocol. This one is called DOH, DNS over HTTP. And this one is deploying much more quickly because it uses the standard TCP port number that would be used by almost all web traffic. And so it becomes very difficult to detect when DOH is happening or to block it from traversing your firewall should you have a firewall. This was seen as a necessary feature. Edge network sovereignty is evidently an old man's game. I don't love this. I really, since I live in the world where I'm working with bad guys, they're trying to get in, I'm trying to keep them out for at least 25 years now. I can see that there will be some other beneficiaries beyond the passionate, patriotic dissident who wants to be able to complain about their government without getting their door kicked in. Yes, I would like those people to have more freedom than they currently have, and I'm on sides. But if the cost of that is that we cannot detect intruders inside of our networks because protocols are going dark deliberately, we may be going too far. It may be that there is some other equilibrium that we ought to have sought. So a lot of reactions have come to the events that I've described. In particular, a couple of years ago, CISO created something called the Protective DNS Resolver. And in that sense, they are now a competitor against Google for 8.8.8.8 and Cloudflare for 1.1.1.1 and Quad 9 and all the rest. And government agencies using this will get whatever filtering CISA thinks they ought to have. That's good. I like that. And they won't be exposing their traffic to non-contracted third parties who may not even be in country. I like that too. This is a good model. I kind of wish that they had taken notice of the work that had been done 12 years earlier to create the basic technology they depended on, but instead they invented it and invented terminology, and the right people that had been working with me at the time did not get the credit they deserve for making that possible. But in any case, it's out there. And I know that there are other efforts by CISA's peer organizations elsewhere in the world. NCSC in the UK, for example, has something like this on the back burner that they're going to announce. I really recommend doing this, even if you only make it available for government agency traffic. You don't want it to be that somebody comes in with a BYOD, sits down in the office network at some agency and starts sending all of their DNS transactions to a non-contracted third party. But you won't be able to see it because the protocol has been designed to prevent you from being able to detect it. So as much as I suggest that you build a wall, you're going to have to build a road to the place you want people to go and hope that the path which is better paved is the one people take. Or you'll have to have a very draconian edge firewall system where everything terminates at your edge and is regenerated so that you can actually see all of the payloads, so that you can make sure DNS tunnels effectively are not being used. Because your DNS signal is one of the primary ways that someone would figure out what you are interested in. If you outsource enough DNS, then you'll be able to see when corporate layoffs are coming, because within a region surrounding their headquarters, everybody is looking at job sites. So you don't see all the traffic, but you see enough to help you figure out what that region cares about or what that agency cares about. So that's a vital thing. I also recommend, if you're going to read anything else besides 7258, please take a look at RFC 8890. It says the internet is for end users. This makes explicit the idea that the internet is no longer a network of networks, and edge networks have no sovereignty, and the internet is viral. If you connect to it at all, then you are going to have to accept everything that it wants to do. I hate that, but that is what the IETF has published there. So short document, worth your time. So this is the current evolution. You can see we keep adding more powered boxes to the chart. And what I'm trying to show here is that, yeah, your phone is inside your firewall, and it has a DNS server it could use, but it won't. And by the way, if you're using the Firefox browser, then your PC won't be using this either, because they don't trust your ISP, and they won't let you trust it either unless you do some significant overrides. So if you use Firefox, you're going to be talking to Cloudflare using a protocol that bypasses your firewall. And that's just again, this is the long tail of a generational response to the Snowden disclosures of 2013. So what about you? I mentioned that China tries to defend their border in cyberspace, and it's iffy. But because there are not borders, you can't defend the borders that don't exist, and you won't have a monopoly on power within borders that don't exist. And the government cannot be held responsible for whatever emanates from an area that does not have borders. So pretty much everything that makes a nation possible is rendered impossible by the internet as it is now evolving. And I don't think that makes nations irrelevant. I like nations just fine, and I think that they will defend their prerogatives. So there will be a lot of things that get done. For example, this was Russia's response. I'm usually not a fan of Russia's response, but in this case, it's a totally rational act that any other country could also be named in this headline, because these are the protocols that make it impossible for a government to defend its economy or to defend its people. It also makes it possible for a CISO to protect their own network, or parents to protect their family network. And so these are a bunch of protocols that if you use them in Russia and you're found, then presumably they kick your door in and haul you away. I don't think that part is so good, but I do think that nations are being rendered less relevant, and they need to wake up. So let me just say, we are here because of the classical rule of law. That's why our nations exist. That's why we have succeeded militarily. That's what we fight for. And it's changed. We have to find something that's a little different and fight for that. And every time there's a new bypass, then there will be more restraints, and vice versa. Every new restraint is going to inspire new bypasses. So I think one thing that Mr. Snowden's disclosures certainly taught us is that it would be better for the nations of the world to negotiate with their citizens than to attempt unilateral force, because no one is strong enough in cyberspace to make unilateral force work. With that, I want to thank you again for inviting me.
Thank you very much.